15 years ago, my husband of nearly 25 years, John, lost his battle with depression and died by suicide. And I will say that, of course, every death is tragic, but I have to say that a death by suicide is just like no other. It's as if this bomb just explodes in your heart. And in the chaos that's really left behind, you have choices and you have to choose, what am I going to survive? And am I just going to survive? And we had 2 children, teenagers at the time. And so, of course, I had to survive, but I just knew that I had to do more than that. And taking survival to another step, which is to thrive, is what I felt I really had to do to honor him. Because, here was a man that lived life to the fullest, and he was beautiful to look at. He was bright. He was so smart. He had friends. He had a family, which was a wife and 2 kids who were loving and adoring, and he loved us and adored us. But he also had a mental disease. And people thought his life was charmed and he had everything. And as I said, he did. He had everything, but he had a mental disease. And he was able to mask that through his life with good looks, with good grades, with great friends, with a sense of congeniality, and people liked to be around him, and he was full of life, and he gardened and he had sports. And, he was able to mask it until he wasn't able to mask it. And then that started a downward spiral of depression. And I knew I had to honor his life because I didn't want him to be remembered by the way in which he died, but rather by the love and the joy that he brought into our lives and so many lives. And, I had a friend who just a few days after John died said to me, Loree, don't waste that pain. And I thought that was just so powerful. And I had to think of how can I turn that pain into some kind of a purpose? And it was around a short few months after that I had learned of an organization called LifeAct. And LifeAct is an organization that helps young people identify the signs of depression and anxiety and mental illness to prevent suicide. And as John was struggling in a downward spiral, which was about 3 years, I learned a lot about his early childhood, which I didn't know. And I believe that the seeds of his depression were planted early in life. Mm-hmm. That was suddenly became this vehicle for me, because if we can help identify young people who are having struggles early in life, then we can get them into the help and the treatment that they need to go on and live strong, productive lives. And so I aligned myself with LifeAct.
As far as you said, he masked for a long time. When he was masking the depression, did you know he was depressed at that time? For those that, are watching right now, as far as I just feel like moms, dads, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, just, are we always going to see signs, or is it at that point where it's the spiral?
Yeah, it was hard. I didn't see this as masking. This was the man I always knew.
Yeah.
And he was that vibrant person who's full of life. And I didn't know these were masks. He had episodes of what I would call environmental or experiential depression that all of us undergo because of life, and maybe you see a counselor for that. And all of that is what I would have considered in the normal realm of what I knew of depression, which turns out was nothing. But when things happened, and I will tell you specifically what happened in his life, is that he lost his job. And so for, at that time, a 50-year-old man whose wife had just left her career to support his in a move out of state, that was devastating. And it was that pivotal point that started tearing away the masks, if you will, and exposing and allowing those demons of depression to come forth. And that began this 3-year downward spiral in which I became aware of so much. And as a caregiver, which I became unwittingly a caregiver, you just beg to believe you're doing what's right and not what you're doing. It's not, it is just as difficult for someone to watch a loved one become debilitated through mental disease as it is to watch their body become ravaged with what we would call a more physical disease.
So true. Yeah.
And the cruel thing of it is, you don't know what to do about it. And there is such a stigma. And to get over that is a huge hurdle. And just to recognize that, you know, John used to say to me in his darkest times, and he would be in racked mental psychic pain. And I remember him saying to me, Loree, you just can't understand what psychic pain feels like. And man, was he right. What kind of psychic pain is it that makes a person feel like the rest of their world and people who love them would be better off without them, and that they have no place in this world? What kind of pain is that? I can't fathom it.
No.
But he had.
Right. And many people watching might have it too, or be thinking about these kinds of things. And so I want to kind of deviate a little, I mean, on subject, but off, but bring up the pandemic. With everything I do with mental health, and you and I have talked on numerous occasions, I just feel like that this has even shaken some of the most relaxed, stress-free, non-anxious people into a bit of anxiety and things that maybe they weren't used to ever feeling. Not to mention the people that already have mental illness. What are you seeing in what you do with LifeAct? And are you noticing a difference now that we're in this pandemic?
Oh, absolutely. When you think of all of that isolation, and if we're speaking about in all age groups, but if we're speaking about young people, let's say 13, to 24, in that young people age group, they are highly social animals. And to have that isolation, to have that lack of extracurricular activities, not being with their friends, spending 75% of their waking hours on screen time, instead of live with people. And then you take, that's tough for someone who is resilient, but take someone who is not resilient, who is already prone or at risk or suffering with mental issues. That's just exacerbated. And so the 4-H Council has done a study, and they did this in the month of 10 days during the month of May, considered the height of the pandemic, with 1,500 students from across the country. And what they found out from these 13 to 19-year-olds was pretty remarkable. And some of the things are that 70% of them, many of them who never struggled before, struggled with some kind of mental anxiety and depression. 61% of them felt isolated, therefore were dealing with the loneliness that came, and over 80% said, we need help. We need our schools, our authority figures to recognize mental health. And that to me was striking, because they want the help. They want mental help. We have physical therapy, we have sports. What do we have to teach young people to have frank conversations and take care of their mental health?
Mental health is, I think, the foundation of good physical health. I mean, it starts up here, that what we're thinking up here resonates within us.
Oh, yeah.
It's really powerful. And I had a friend that said, it's kind of ironic that epilepsy is considered a disease, yet we have such a hard time talking about mental health as a disease, but it is. It is.
And the brain is an organ, like any other organ. And we're discovering so much, which is wonderful. We're getting there, but we're not there at all. And it's exciting research going on about brain imaging, and how, with brain imaging, about how we can target medications that will really help individualized for every person, because one of the problems that people get into is they get on medication and it's not the right one for them. It might
Right.
be for Tom or Susie, but it's not right for them. And so they get off the medication and they don't want to go on anything else. And it's just so tough.
Yeah.
There is hope in the studies and the research that's being done to help individualize treatment plans and medications.
I have such a hard time. I mean, I think of our children and teenagers that are now living in a pandemic, and I feel like years to come, how will this impact their mental health? You know, you can't help but think of that because they are isolated and they are lonely and they're not doing things that they normally would be doing. I mean, what are some of the things that we should be looking out for, that parents watching should be looking out for?
And that's really difficult because it's hard to tell what is normal teenage angst.
Yeah, right.
You know, from these signs. And there are typical signs. Is there sleeplessness, or are they sleeping too much? Are they eating too much? Are they not eating? Are they more irritable than normal? And again, given the fact that we're in a pandemic, these things may accelerate and you just disregard it. But they are reaching out in that way.
Yeah.
And it's knowing your child and what is unusual for your child. I think it is really key. Now, you get further on in, you know, someone who becomes very, you know, is exhibiting greater signs. Are they giving away things that are precious to them?
Oh.
One would hope that we are able to identify these things prior to that. But that's one of the things that our LifeAct school program does. And we go into, difficult now because everything is virtual or non-existent about having people come in with school programs. But in a typical year, we will go into 25,000 schools. I mean, we will give our program to 25,000 students in close to 200 schools. And of that, it's usually in a given year, about 8% of those students will come forward and identify themselves as at risk. Well, interestingly enough, in the school year 2019, 2020, half of that being during the pandemic, we delivered our program to 23,000 students, and 12.5% of those students came forward and said they were at risk. That's a huge leap in a half of a year time. That is proof positive to me that these kids are struggling during the pandemic and believing that they need help, and they're reaching out. And they're not necessarily going to reach out to their parents. They'll reach out to someone who they don't feel threatened by, who doesn't have as big an impact on their life, who may be a LifeAct instructor. They will also reach out to their peers. They'll say something to their friends that their friends may disregard. But if the friends know and are able to recognize signs that someone may be struggling with depression or anxiety in themselves or their peers, they are our gatekeepers to get young people into the appropriate care to help them.
Yeah. Because it can be, I don't want to say cured, because even with my own anxiety and what I deal with mental health wise, I'm pretty open about just saying I'm a work in progress. It's constant work. You know, there are things that will trigger you and things that definitely, but you can manage it. And that's where the hope lies. You know, none of us are walking around on this planet perfect. Right. We all have our little, things. And I just think that when it comes to mental health, I'm just so glad that people like yourself are vulnerably out there, brave as can be, telling stories that are not easy to tell. And hopefully out of all of that comes, saving lives, because it's kind of like this just silent, I don't know, it just flies under the radar. Even though we're talking more, I still have such an unsettled feeling. And I don't know if some of that comes from the pandemic itself. And I think of like you're saying, that jump up to 12%. Well, then what are the ramifications of these kids down the line? And should we be thinking of maybe, something after this pandemic is over, whatever the new normal is? Should there be something that they maybe go through? Like there's maybe courses or meetings of some kind that gets them back on track, because everything is off.
Yeah, it's very true. And so all of this is happening at a time for students are feeling the signs of anxiety and depression,
Yeah.
stressors more, at a time when the resources are pulled back. They don't have access to programs at school. Trying to get in to see counselors is really tough. They're so overbooked, right? Because everyone is feeling a need for this. So it's a double whammy. And in a way, this pandemic that we're in is going to be leading to the next pandemic, which is a mental health pandemic. And we have to address that.
Yeah.
Only way we can address it is through awareness.
Right.
Speaking out, me speaking out, more and more people speaking out, because awareness leads to education. Education leads to funding. Funding leads to research, and research leads to some solutions. There were a number of years ago when you wouldn't say cancer, you would say the C word, and you certainly wouldn't say breast cancer. Boy, has that changed. And because it's changed, there's a ton of funding going into those programs for research, and we're seeing huge strides. There is so much we can do for the mind. We're just at the tip of it. But we have to, sounds so cliche, but we have to remove that stigma, and we have to bring awareness.
Right. When he was in the spiral, and it was that period of where you were finding things out, did you ever imagine suicide? I mean, I just want to, and I hope that that's not too personal, but I'm thinking of, people that deal with depression, and be it their child's depressed, their brother's depressed, the mom's depressed. I don't know that their mind goes to suicide, or could that happen because this person's depressed? Yeah. So what would you say about that?
Well, it's interesting because John's best friend died by suicide.
Oh, wow.
15 years earlier. And when he was in this downward spiral and suffering so much, and I mean, there were times I would find him curled up on the bed in the fetal position, just in agony with the psychic pain he was feeling. And it was very scary. And I didn't know what to do. And he was in counseling. And it was like, where is this going? It's not helping. And it was so darn scary. And I would say to him, you're not going to hurt yourself, are you? You're not going to hurt yourself. And he would say, no, I'd never hurt myself. I see what it did to Bill's family.
Wow.
And now I trusted and believed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard. A lot of people have reached out to me in regards to suicide, and I'm almost, and again, I don't want to say shocked, because I know that it's a huge problem, but I've had parents reaching out, and I mean, and like you just said, it's all ages, but I think that because of the stigma that still exists with suicide, and that most people seem to sort of keep that under the radar still, now that we're shedding light on so much mental health, and we are focusing on it, we're hearing more and more about it, and it really is a problem. It's a major problem, and I completely agree with you that the mental health pandemic is something that is coming out of this pandemic. And even for those that aren't, maybe, we're talking about things like working from home and the pressures, and moms doing everything from being a mom to working to, there's such blurred lines, and everything feels chaotic, and routines are shot out the window, and things like that. So, I mean, where do we go from here? What would be, with you're doing a ton, obviously, but what would you want the message to be to those watching, and hopefully the brains out there that want to research and fund? I mean, what would be your wish?
My wish is that everyone becomes aware that this is real, and that we can remove that stigma, so that people who are suffering don't have to suffer in silence. No one should ever have to suffer in silence like my John did. And no one should ever have to be left behind like I was and my two children were, to have those questions of why and what if and what could I have done.
Yeah.
We have to do what we can do now so that no family is left with those kinds of questions. And we have to be aware and not be afraid to talk about it. You know how tough it is to talk about it. I know how tough it is to talk about it. When John died, it would have been so, people knew that my husband had died. It would have been so easy to say he died suddenly by a heart attack. Oh, okay, then there's sympathy and empathy. When you say suicide, it's a conversation stopper. But I will say, the conversation stopper for people whom I do not care as much for as the people who, once they learned that my husband had died by suicide, came out of the woodwork, as they do with you, and want to share with you, because it's almost this secret society that we all belong to, and you need a safe space. You don't have a safe space of someone to talk to. I have so many examples of going into a store, a home's goods store, and the woman came up to me, an associate, and she's in tears, and she says, I know about your loss, and I lost my cousin, and they have nowhere to go, nowhere to talk about it. And that's just so wrong. It's so wrong. We have to urge our educators to have programs in their schools to help young people. And it's not just high school. At LifeAct, we started with high school. And for 16 years, we dealt with our program in the high school. And then there became this tremendous need for middle school students to teach them about recognizing depression, preventing suicide. Who would have thought? But if you look at the statistics, it's alarming that from 2008 to 2018, the rate of suicide, and I'm talking about Ohio, has risen dramatically, an average of 56%. The greatest increase, a huge increase, is in young people, ages 10 to 14. The rate of suicide has increased 177%.
It's horrifying.
It's just unbelievable. And similar, I can't recall the statistic for ages 14 to 19, but it's very large. So we have to get at these young people to get them good mental health before their brains become hardwired. It's difficult once you get older. The older you become, the harder it is to change the functioning of the brain. But if you can identify young people, 50% of all mental illness can be diagnosed by the time a child is 14, 75% by the time they're 75, they're 17.
Yeah.
50% of brain illness can be diagnosed by the time a child is 14, 75% by the time they're 17. Boy, let's identify it in these young people and help them to live the long and productive lives they deserve.
Amen. Amen. For anyone watching today, because one thing I want to make sure that we include is resource. I mean, obviously there's what you're involved with, but what would you say as far as, and you can give us this information, you can email it and stuff like that too. But if you just want to speak a little bit about people watching going, whoa, this is my child, this is my husband, this is my wife, friend right now, I see this struggle happening. Where can they go in a world where things are virtual?
A lot of counselors are conducting virtual sessions. As I have learned, it is tough to get into those now, but I think that more practices are opening up more. But to get the help they need as caregivers to provide the appropriate care to their young people or their loved one or their husband or their spouse or their mother, brother, sister. But caregivers also need help to deal with this, because that can be scary. It can turn to anger instead of love and help, but you can't love someone through mental illness. You can love them enough to get them the help, the professional help that they need.
Yeah.
So, and to talk openly, if everyone can just talk openly, my husband has been diagnosed with a heart issue. We share it with everybody, right? But, oh no, my husband is suffering with major depression and anxiety. We cover it up. We have to be courageous enough, each of us in our own lives, to talk frankly, openly, and honestly about our mental health and the mental health of those we love.
Amen. Amen. How are you doing? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people watching that have dealt with what you did or something maybe similar or know someone. I mean, how are you getting through? I'm sure it's different now than 15 years ago, but what did you find helped you?
You know, early on, a number of years actually, I would see people who had lost someone to suicide who were happy again. And I used to think, oh, I can't be me. I'm never going to be really happy again. And I really gave a lot of thought to that and thought about John. And I really believe that our loved ones that we have lost to suicide would want us to be happy again because they are at peace and want us to be happy again and to find joy and to find love in life. And I have reached that point where I have happiness and I have joy in my life. And I'm always connected to John and I always talk to him. I talk to him every time I talk about suicide, depression, anxiety, because his voice was silenced. And I have to be his voice in order to have his legacy of the love and the joy that he brought into my life live on.
Loree, let's talk about LifeAct and what exactly you do. What's the goal there?
LifeAct is an educational program which we bring into the schools, middle school and high school, which educates children, young people, to recognize the signs of depression in themselves and in their peers, so that these young people who find themselves at risk can identify and then get the help that they need. And LifeAct has strong connections. We are not counselors, but we have strong connections and we are aligned with University Hospital's Rainbow Babies and Children's Child Adolescent program, psychiatry program. And we get the kids the help they need. And we have been seeing remarkable results that up to 12% of the students to whom we deliver our program reach out and say that they are at risk. It may be minor to severe, but they are at risk and they need help. And we find that to be so wonderful that we know we're saving lives. We know. And during this virtual time, LifeAct has been nimble enough to, because we can't go into the classrooms very often, to present our program virtually. We also have a program with University Hospital's Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital called Life Chat, where young people can have a live conversation, virtual conversation with a clinical counselor when they feel that they're in crisis. And that's what LifeAct does. We've been doing it with this is our 20th year, and 250,000 students over that time frame have received our program. And we know that we have saved lives.
Oh, absolutely.
Forward to having an impact on children going forward.
Thank you for what you're doing. It's just, it's where we're going, you know, and with this pandemic getting bigger and bigger and it shifting more into mental health now, I think that this is something that is necessary.
And I had something that one of the students who went through our program said, no one has ever talked to me honestly and openly about my mental health. It's a high school student. No one had ever talked to him about his mental health. And that was so refreshing to him.
Yeah.
We need to do that in the school. We need to have that be part of the curriculum. LifeAct is one part of it. It has to be integrated throughout the school curriculum. Attention to mental health.
Agreed. Agreed.